thank you everybody for joining us. This is the 7th annual Frankfurt in Paris event. Beginning tomorrow in Frankfurt, Germany is the Frankfurt Book Fair, a annual fair and celebration of international communication, books and ideas. And there's no better way to get that event started than stopping at the Global Center here in Paris and talking about books and ideas. And I could not think of a better person to join us this year than David Scott. So thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. So David is the Ruth and William Lubick Professor at Columbia and former chair of the Department of Anthropology at Columbia. Congratulations on your survival of that. He is the founder and editor of the journal Small Acts and the director of the Small Acts Project. He's the author of Refashioning Futures, Conscripts of Modernity, Omens of Adversity, and Stuart Hall's Voice. And he is the author of the forthcoming Irreparable Evil, an essay in moral and repertory history, which is coming out in the very beginning of 2024. So we're here to talk about David's forthcoming book. We'll talk a little bit about your background and how you got to this work, and then get into some of the big ideas that you have going on in this book. And I should say too, I mean, this work to me is really significant, and I think you and I come out of, in some ways, similar traditions, or certainly have spent time in similar traditions. And the more I've engaged with this work, the more it has changed my thinking. So I really appreciate that. So I love origin stories. So what is the origin of this work, and how does it relate to your work to date? How do we get to the point where you're making this argument?
Thank you very much, Eric. I too like origin stories, though it's not straightforward or simple to tell origin stories, because of course typically what we're talking about are multiple origins. Most immediately, to begin there, I suppose the immediate context is trying to think about dimensions of what I have been calling the age of human rights. The sort of post-Cold War shift in the terrain of kinds of understandings of the world we live in, the discontents that pervade the world we live in, and how the world we live in might be changed. And in the context of the rise of human rights and of humanitarianism in the 1990s, there emerged as part of this discursive field a new concern with reparations toward the end of the 1990s in the United States and in the Caribbean. So there emerged a concern about how to think about the aftermaths of New World slavery in the context of the language of human rights. And the context of what conversation about repair, about compensation, might reshape the conversation of that past in the present. That's one, the sort of the rise of the discussion about human rights. And that conversation about human rights is important because it transformed the ways in which we talked about temporality. It transformed the ways in which we talked about harm. It transformed the ways in which we talked about wrongdoing. And therefore, it transformed the ways in which one imagined a language through which the wrongs and the harms of the past continue to live in the present, and how one might intervene to transform them. So that's one, and perhaps in some sense the most immediate context. Another, in deeper context, in some respect, is that all of my work, I'd say, at least since Refashioning Futures, and therefore since the late 1990s, has been concerned with the question, how do we think the question of social and political change? And in some sense, I grew up in the age of revolution, the age of radical social change, the age of certain understandings of radicalism shaped by Marxism. And I grew up in a certain sense in a context, post-colonial Jamaica, in which I experienced the dismantling of the discourses of social change that were framed by national liberation, that were framed by the anti-colonial revolution, that were framed by ideas about radical social democracy. And therefore, all of my scholarly work has been preoccupied with what to do with the aftermaths of radical social and political discourse, how to think social change in the wake of the disintegration, conceptually, historically, and politically, of what Marxism had once been presumed to do for radical, for thinking radical social change. And therefore, gradually, over the course of the last decade or more, I have been obliged to try to think about the relationship between the new kinds of discourses emerging in the context of the age of human rights against the backdrop of the collapse of the old discourses of social change. And one of the first forays into this was a book which was published in 2014 called Omens of Adversity, which was an attempt to think about the aftermaths of the collapse of the Grenada Revolution and the fate, in some sense, of those who had been arrested after the U.S. invasion of Grenada in October 1983, and who were charged and sentenced for the murder of Maurice Bishop, who was the Prime Minister of Grenada. And there were many things about that project, but the way in which it links to this question of reparation is that those revolutionaries, former revolutionaries in the 1980s, could not imagine their futures in relation to any conception of revolutionary justice, whatever that might mean. Although they initially did try to pursue that direction, their entire plight came to be consumed by the presence of Amnesty International and by the new discourse of transitional justice. And therefore their futures were lifted, as it were, out of the age of revolution and deposited inside of a kind of discourse shaped by neoliberalism, by neoconservatism, by the story of transitional justice. And that marked, in some way, what they could hope for. So I've been thinking about this relationship between these different, as it were, paradigms of social change for some time.
I mentioned before that you were the chair of the anthropology department, and is this style of thinking typical of anthropology, or
So this is the kind of question that may get me into trouble with my colleagues. But
Sorry.
I have a complicated, I think, relationship to anthropology. I think I have a complicated relationship to disciplines as such. In terms of my own disciplinary formation, I, in a very real way, backed into anthropology. When I came to graduate school from Jamaica in 1981, I began as a student in a psychology department, imagining that I was going to be a psychoanalyst, which was my obsession at the time. And I fled the psychology department and fled into an anthropology department and found that, as we all do, pursuing PhDs, that you have to do a comprehensive exam and you are slowly being disciplined into and through the literatures of the department that you are in, however you got there. And for me, that was in many ways fortuitous, because I found myself in a disciplinary space in the context of disciplines in the United States that offered me the most capacious room in which I could pursue whatever it is I wanted to pursue. And it enabled me, in some respect, a many-windowed house in which to look out from where I was located around me at the other disciplines and what they were doing. And I've always had a preoccupation with literature and with history and with philosophy. And anthropology provided a location filled with its own disciplinary anxieties, of course, but that at least didn't disable or didn't completely frown upon my transdisciplinary preoccupations. And I have found myself I was going to say committed. Maybe I will use that word, committed to anthropology, and certainly committed to the department at Columbia. And so to respond more directly to your question, perhaps not. Perhaps it's not the kind of language or the kind of orientation that many anthropologists feel comfortable with. But it has taken me a while to find my own comfort levels and with the many disciplinary cross currents that run through me. And I think that what I am grateful to anthropology for is allowing me a comfortable home in which to pursue those preoccupations.
And it seems like, from the outside of the field, it seems like it is a space that is sort of allowing of that, in the sense that there is debate about what do we mean by anthropology and in ways that don't exist in other kinds of fields.
Absolutely. I mean, I think on the one hand that Columbia anthropology, if I may say so, is distinctive in the sense that we have which was one of the challenges when I was chair, that we have colleagues, I have colleagues who do their own thing radically, who insist on being their own distinctive intellectuals. But I think it's also the case that anthropology, and US anthropology in particular, grew up inside of enormous internal anxieties about its relationship to Native American genocide, in relation to colonialism, etc., that has produced a kind of recurrent reflexivity that prompts anthropologists to continuously ask themselves questions, fundamental questions about what exactly they're doing and why, what the justifications are, what the etc. So I think, yes, that I have been lucky to find myself in a discipline that is uneasy about its own identity.
Yep. And I think that my guess as well that allows you then to have such a wide variety of kind of intellectual reference points. And I think that's something that that I take away from this particular work is the kinds of authors, and particularly the kind of Arendtian dimension that kind of exists throughout this work, is not something I would think of necessarily as typical of anthropology, but is such a great usage of that, I think, of her work and engagement with her work, and how the deficiencies, and as someone who is in a discipline that is uneasy with itself, there's an unease, I think, that is part. I mean, you talk about this a little bit in the work, that there's an unease with some of these intellectual reference points, where they're useful, where they don't go far enough.
Right. I mean, I do think that one of the features of the last decades, perhaps, of U.S. anthropology is a constant reflection on the conceptual and ideological adequacies of the theoretical paradigms, etc., that are at play. And so I don't think that that's just me. I think it pervades the discipline over the last 10, 15 years. I think that what's not typical is the kind of preoccupation that I bring to that set of uneases, as it were, and the particular figures who are part of my own intellectual world. So, for me, I have been preoccupied with figures who help me to think about the character of the present in particular ways. So folk like C.L.R. James or Stuart Hall, or to go broader still, folk like Hayden White or Bernard Yack or Reinhard Koselleck, people who help me to think about the historicity of concepts or of ideologies that enable me to think about the present. And Hannah Arendt has certainly become an enormously important, and for me, enormously embattled kind of reference. So there are those figures on the one hand, and also figures like who derive their intellectual heritage from Wittgenstein, and therefore help to think about concepts in particular, and what for me has become enormously important, to think about the loss of concepts, because part of what this work, Irreparable Evil, is about is trying to think about, on the one hand, the loss of old organizing concepts, as I said earlier, in particular that of revolution, and the emergence of another complex of concepts around reparation. So for me, the question of historicity has been shaped less by the significance of social and political histories, although that's very present to me, but of the historicity of the concepts that we use to try to think the worlds that we live in.
And I think that maybe this segues well into, the subtitle of the book is an essay in moral and repertory history. And I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what you mean by a moral history and a repertory history.
So, first of all, what I don't mean is a moralizing history. And what I don't mean is a history of morals. Although histories of morals or ethics and normativities of one sort or another are enormously important to what I'm trying to do in the book. I suppose what I'm trying to get at through the idea of a moral history is an attention to the historicities of human conduct. And I want to get at the ways in which human conduct um, is shaped around the ends that human beings pursue, the means by which human beings pursue these ends, the ways in which these ends are evaluated in terms of their rightness or wrongness, their goodness or badness, etc. The kinds of virtues that people acquire in structured or unstructured ways to enable them to pursue those ends or those goals. So I'm trying to get at that level of the human condition, if you like, and again you can hear Hannah Arendt in the background there. I'm trying to get at that dimension of human activity and human pursuits that is connected to politics, but that is not immediately subsumable by an instrumental conception of political ends. And in that context, what obviously in this book has become very important for me in thinking about human conduct and in the context of a moral history is to think about those dimensions of human conduct that have become entangled in the particular kinds of wrongdoing that I want to call, along with others, evil. So evil for me is a dimension of a moral history, and an attention to evil is a dimension of a moral history. And, you know, part of what I want to get at also in thinking about a moral history is again connected to this conception of an age of human rights in which a certain attention has come much more into the foreground of thinking about the human condition, of thinking about of rethinking universalities of one sort or another, about thinking about those kinds of pasts, atrocities, let's call them, that have significantly shaped the moral human present. So I want to use the idea of a moral history to capture this. The other part of it, which for me has been very important, way beyond this book, is that, to my mind, thinking about political futures, which in a certain sense is where I am headed, through a long detour, I might say, is that for me, given the kinds of deficiencies, I don't know if that's the best word, but that characterized the ways in which human futurities were thought about within Marxism, within various kinds of liberationist, emancipationist discourses and practices, have led me down a road, so to speak, of trying to think below the threshold of what we immediately call political activity, and to think about those activities that inevitably will inform political activities, but that are much more concerned with the human ends that we are pursuing. And there again, we are in a dimension of human activity that I want to call the purview of the moral. And therefore, for me, for example, Conscripts of Modernity and Omens of Adversity were books that were concerned with the tragic. And it seems to me, upon reflection, that in a certain sense, I was there, that in the pursuit of the tragic, I am already pursuing a dimension of human conduct that I would now, as it were, fold into the wider concern with a moral history.
And if I'm getting this correctly, I mean, the what's so important is the way in which the conduct of the past, and particularly the evils of the past, shape the possibilities of the present
Absolutely.
and the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why, for me, the idea of a moral history is connected to the idea of a reparatory history.
Yeah.
And I think of reparatory history as a dimension of a moral history. And a reparatory history is that dimension of a moral history that seeks to think about the kinds of past wrongdoings, and in particular past atrocities that have not been repaired, and that live on in the present in ways that undo, that trouble, that discombobulate, that unsettle, that haunt the present.
Well, let's get a little bit then into really the kind of more specifics then of this book, because I think the evil at the center of the book is significant. The book is about New World slavery, and the kind of, there's on the one hand the surface level of the brutality of slavery as you describe in the book, but that on and of itself is insufficient, right? It's not enough just to think about what was perpetrated upon the victims of the moment, but the inheritance of that into the future. And I wonder if you can maybe unpack that a little bit. What is
Sure.
it? Yeah.
Sure. So I, of course, don't want to discount the self-evident brutality of New World slavery. What one encounters in thinking about, reading about, in viewing reconstructions of New World slavery is the palpable violence and violation that pervaded New World slavery. New World slavery was a systemic mode of brutalizing human beings to extract labor power from the enslaved. So that's clearly very, very, very important. But it seems to me that the focus on the spectacular violence done to the bodies of the enslaved, first of all, has a kind of ideological motivation, which I'm interested in, because I'm always interested in what it is we think we are doing with the modalities of representation that we produce. What is it that we're trying to solicit by producing images of enslavement that have this particular form rather than something else? But what interests me, quite apart from that self-evident brutality, is that New World slavery also involved the destruction of the conditions of a former way of life. That is to say that the kidnapped, enslaved peoples transported from the West African coast across the Middle Passage to the Americas, to the Caribbean, transshipped to the United States, were not simply physically brutalized, but they were detached from a former way of life, and they were inserted into an artificially constructed way of life in which families were separated. So languages were dispersed, the language groups were dispersed. Children were separated from parents. Couples were decoupled, etc. So what took place was the disintegration of a connection to a former mode of life, and the insertion into this artificial kind of social formation, namely the plantation. And what's been very, very interesting to me is to think about the plantation as a space of the destruction of the cultural assumptions by which a people and their forebears lived. And this, so one of the texts that's been very, there is an old Caribbean debate, the debate about creolization, etc. That has been in and around and worked its way through various dimensions of this question, because in some sense it's a self-evident issue. But the more recent text that has been very, very stimulating to me, and which I talk about in the book, is Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, which is a book that was much criticized when it first appeared, much criticized by other philosophers, but in particular by anthropologists, because Lear sidestepped, in some sense, the physical brutality of the destruction of Native American peoples, and focused much more on something else, which he called the form of life of the Crow. And Lear was interested in the way in which the Crow, as it were, found themselves as they got moved onto the reservation into a transformed way of life, the nature of which they could have had no previous understanding of. So whereas the Sioux, for example, as opposed to the Crow, generated a resistance to the encroaching advance of the U.S. state, the Crow negotiated, as it were, a peaceful settlement, thinking that the U.S. state would enable them to keep the Sioux at bay. And what Lear is pointing our attention to here, which I think is very important, is that there is a kind of violence that the Crow were able to avoid, but there was a kind of violence that they willy-nilly found themselves in the middle of, and for which they had no categories, no concepts, no intellectual preformation, as it were, to help them to confront. And that's what interests me, that when those kidnapped, enslaved people were imprisoned on those slave ships crossing the Atlantic, they could have had no conception whatsoever, quite apart from the beatings and the violence done to their bodies. They could have had no preconception of the world they would have to endure. And that's what interests me. It's that question that interests me, because that question to me shapes any contemporary understanding of the prospects and possibilities of New World Black societies.
In the book, you make reference to the Crow, how like at a certain point there was no history, right? They talk about how like history ended, right? Because the Crow way of life ended at this point, and it gets to what you were saying about this lack of conception, right, about the future.
Exactly. It's a complicated argument, but apparently, Plenty Coups is telling his story to a white visitor who's writing a book, and he tells him that when the Crow were obliged to enter the reservation, after that point nothing happens. And it's that phrasing, that nothing happens, that provokes Jonathan Lear to try to, if that is so, how do we understand the nature of that historical experience? And there are any number of problems, anthropological, philosophical, etc., with that set of concerns and his particular approach. But it was very provocative to me because it's the same kind of question that I want to answer. As I say in the book, one can imagine an enslaved person saying, once we entered the hold of that slave ship, nothing happened. Because the categories through which I had been, one can imagine someone saying, the categories through which I narrated my relationship to a past, to a community, etc., were no longer valid in the world in which I was being inserted. So that interests me, profoundly interests me, as a way of rethinking what atrocity is, what destruction is. It's a destruction of the conditions of a form of life, more so than the destruction of one's physical being.
You describe this right in the book as like the destruction of the life world.
Of a life world, yes.
Yeah, that it's the destruction of both a way of life, but also one's imagination of one's future.
Absolutely.
And the future of their descendants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And obviously, New World African peoples have reconstructed worlds and survived and done more than survive. But we don't pay sufficient attention to the conditions of that reconstruction as we think about the Creole worlds of New World black folk in the Caribbean, but also across the Americas.
Switching gears just slightly, you talk, just to kind of go back to these conceptions of evil, you talk about incomparable evil, incommensurable evil, and I wonder if you could maybe address ways in which we can think about.
So
those concepts.
as I turned my attention systematically to thinking about the study of atrocity, I obviously encountered the way in which the study of atrocity is dominated in many ways, in many ways, by the study of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the event that structures the ways in which one thinks about atrocity. And what became fascinating to me were the dimensions through which the Holocaust commands the space of the study of atrocity. And one of the ways in which it does so is through the production of a sense that in many ways the Holocaust is no longer an historical event. The Holocaust is a meta-event. The Holocaust is an event that shapes the ways in which other presumptively similar kinds of events are to be understood. And in that sense, the Holocaust has a meta kind of character to it. The Holocaust shapes the way in which we think about the 20th century. The 20th century is often described as the most evil of recent centuries, and the event at the center of this idea is the Holocaust. The Holocaust also shapes the way in which one thinks about the kinds of practices that atrocities are about, in the sense that the Holocaust as the motivated killing, the sense of atrocity as motivated mass killing is how we think about atrocity. So motivated death lies at the center of our imagination of what an atrocity is. And, of course, in many ways, to go back to old Hannah Arendt, Arendt is the intellectual who in many ways is at the center of this conception. Even though Arendt's idea of what the death camps and so on is far more complicated than simple mass killing. But this idea of an historical event that is exceptional, incomparable, that is not any longer merely historical, that is definitive, not simply of the history of Jewish people, but of the history of any kind of event that is in some sense like that. Its place in the defining of the 20th century and its place in defining what ultimate evil looks like became in some way a formation, an ideological formation, a conceptual formation that I had to work around and through, because what's interesting about the story of New World slavery in contemporary work on evil is that although it's not there, it is only there as merely an historical fact. New World slavery has no conceptual shaping force in helping us to understand the conceptual variability of atrocity. New World slavery as an atrocity lives only in relation to that defining event of the Holocaust. And so there as I try to do in a rather long chapter of the book, is to try to think through the making of this notion of an incomparable evil, and in particular to try and think systematically about the way in which someone like Hannah Arendt is thought about. I mean, I say this endlessly in the book, that although I do quarrel with Arendt and Arendt's views, that it's less Arendt that troubles me, because obviously, and it's the origins of totalitarianism that I'm preoccupied with. When Arendt is writing that book, and you can feel it vibrating in the text itself, she's writing in the immediate wake of the discovery of the camps, right? And so her own sense of both the unbelievableness of it, the outrage, etc., is shaping her understanding of what she's trying to think about. But her more contemporary interpreters and disciples have not been willing to interrogate Arendt and to try to think about the kinds of stereotypes that are pervasive in the origins of totalitarianism. The stereotypes about black people, the stereotypes in particular about African people, the dismissal of New World slavery as being as being a kind of slavery. It's not clear whether it's New World slavery or of ancient slavery that she's talking about, but she's talking about slavery. Bears no comparison at all to the Holocaust. And none of her interpreters has been willing to try to ask anything constructive about the way in which that particular dismissive attitude toward other kinds of atrocities is part and parcel of the conceptual technology through which the exceptional character of the death camps comes into view. And so a good part of my own deconstructive work is, I'm not a scholar of the Shoah. But what was important to me was to try to understand the ways in which Arendt has been positioned as the foundational figure through whom a certain picture of the Holocaust comes into being, and through whom, in relation to that, a certain conception of evil radical evil and the banality of evil come into view, because the whole discourse about evil, as you know, I'm sure, turns around the internal battle about which of these concepts Arendt's final allegiance was to, and which of these concepts, radical evil from the origins of totalitarianism or the banality of evil from Eichmann in Jerusalem, has more conceptual validity. And I am not interested in that debate. That debate has a particular kind of in-house Arendt set of concerns. But I am interested in the way in which the focus on that debate by Arendt scholars has occluded other ways of thinking about what's germane about Hannah Arendt and what it is she missed or dismissed in the work that she did in the origins of totalitarianism.
In relation to that, I mean, and you talked about this in just a moment ago, the superfluous, you didn't use the term, but the superfluous of people, right? And that the mass extermination of superfluous people, of people who did not fit the ideology, or in the ultimate case for Arendt, in which there's no idea whatsoever.
Right.
People are so superfluous it could be completely arbitrary.
So this idea is crucial. Arendt's idea of the technologies through which people were made superfluous as people, human beings as human beings are made superfluous, is more important to Arendt than the actual technologies through which death was produced. What Arendt is really interested in are the conditions in which people were made killable in some respect, right? And in all of the preoccupation with the Holocaust as a death machine, what has often been missed, except in the work of people like Richard Bernstein, work which I think is enormously important, although I am critical of it for various reasons, as you know, is that Arendt is interested in those practices by which human beings were transformed. In which a certain kind of I'm going to use this term because it's very important here, I think, the way in which a certain kind of social death, Arendt uses the term living dead, right? And one of the things that started to fascinate me as I was doing this work was the ways in which this idea of social death from Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death has itself fed into some of the work done on the Holocaust itself. And there's a particular theorist of evil, Claudia Card, whose work is, to my mind, profoundly important, and who wrote a book called The Atrocity Paradigm. But in the work subsequent to that book, a book called Confronting Evils, she mobilizes Orlando Patterson's idea of social death to redefine how we should think about genocide. And so in many ways, part of my project was to suggest that one perhaps should think about the construction of conditions in which certain people are obliged to live certain kinds of life as itself a kind of evil. That the construction of certain kinds of life can be as evil as the construction of certain kinds of death. And to my mind, Arendt already in many ways had elements of that conception in this idea of making human beings as human beings superfluous.
And in that, like, what is missed by Arendt is, what if the extermination of a person is not the there can be other ends that are that are evil, and it's not the extermination of the person, but the extermination of the life world.
Exactly.
Right. And to me that as I said in the beginning, like what was really, I think, really eye opening for me was really thinking in those terms, because as somebody who has read a lot, a New School PhD, it's mandatory. Read my share of Hannah Arendt and engaged with those questions. Right. There is a tendency to kind of think of the paradigm and her concepts as being sort of the way in which you think about these things. Right. Evil was thought of in the dichotomy that you mentioned before, banality or radical, or but that there are these alternative ways that still are thinking within that tradition, that can, I think, bring in cases that are not 20th century cases. I mean, you talk in the book a little bit about how, or certainly my kind of reading, the 20th century would not be possible were it not for the plantation slavery system. The world that we exist that made that possible was the plantation slavery system.
I mean, it is extraordinary to me the way in which, I don't know what else to call it, so I'm going to call it the fetishization of the 20th century as the century of atrocity, and undoubtedly the 20th century was a century of atrocity, but to think that it was the most, to use language like that is to disable a critical function, right? And to disable the prospect of understanding the ways in which earlier atrocities shaped the ways in which we live. And one of the contrasts that really interested me in thinking about the Shoah on the one hand and New World slavery on the other hand is the relationship between New World slavery, to use the terms that you used a while ago, in creating the conditions of the world in which we live. I mean, New World slavery is part of the very membrane of the making of modern capitalism. And, we're not talking about an event as such, right? We're talking about an institution that was part of the very making of the modern world itself, right? And therefore, I tell people it's very, very difficult for someone like myself to walk in a city like Paris or London and not look around and see a world that institutionally, a world that in terms of the built environment of the city itself is made on the labor of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean. So there is a direct relationship, it seems to me, between the atrocity of New World slavery and the contemporary world in which we live.
So I think that this will sort of leave it to my last question, and I think I have maybe my own idea, and what you were just saying about walking around the streets is sort of is a little bit leading for me, at least in that direction. But what is to be done about irreparable evil? What responsibility do we have?
Yeah. That's a deep question. And there are many dimensions, of course, as you can imagine, to that question. But before, if you don't mind, before I try to think about that with you a little bit, I wanted to contrast this idea of an evil that is incomparable to thinking about evils that are incommensurable. Because that contrast, I think, is enormously important, and I want to highlight the work of the philosopher. I get that from, namely Lawrence Mordecai Thomas, because Thomas, who is African American and Jewish, wrote a book called Vessels of Evil, which had an enormous impact on me as I tried to write Irreparable Evil. And what Lawrence Mordecai Thomas is interested in is to try and evade what he calls invidious comparisons. comparisons that try to think about whether or not the suffering of Jews and the suffering of blacks can be thought about in the same paradigm, or which was worse, etc., etc. New World Slavery or the Holocaust. And Thomas wants to evade that kind of invidious comparison as doing a disservice to both histories and to both traditions, with which I fundamentally agree. And he wants to find a way of thinking about New World Slavery and the Holocaust as incommensurable, that is to say, as not comparable, but that what you're comparing are different kinds of practices of evil. And it's in some sense his work that alerted me to the ways in which one can think about death or motivated mass death as one kind of ultimate evil, but not the only one. That one can think about, and he draws on Orlando Patterson as well, one can think of as the forced natal alienation of the enslaved and the dependence that was produced on the plantations, the destruction of their natal cultures as itself another kind of ultimate evil. And so it's that one wants to be able intelligently, compassionately, to talk about different kinds of historical atrocities without the invidiousness of trying to suggest that one was worse than the other. And that seems to me to be enormously important. The question of what can be done is hard because one of the things that shapes the work in the book is my own sense of that there are wounds that will not heal, that there are pasts that cannot be undone, that in some sense, as responsible citizens of a global world, we have to be able to recognize that there are ruptures and atrocities, wrongdoings and evils that have produced the world that we now live in. That can't be papered over. That can't be that handouts of scholarships or monuments or museums and things of that sort won't remove the effects of that past on the present, especially in instances in which we're talking about generations of enslavement and subsequently generations of a denial of responsibility and of a refusal to offer any mode of reparatory justice. And so those are what, again, Hannah Arendt would call irreconcilable pasts. That one can't imagine oneself letting go of the idea that it should not have happened. Those pasts are irreconcilable. One can't reconcile oneself to the fact that that was done to the people from whom I come. So there is a deep and profound sense, I think, in which certain kinds of atrocities are irreparable. They cannot be forgiven, as again Arendt would say, and therefore they cannot be repaired. Which is not to say that we don't have a moral and political responsibility to address in material and moral ways those pasts. And it seems to me that there are restorative, compensatory, material practices that are self-evidently available to modern European states, to the hegemonic state of the United States, to confront the simple fact that they exist on the basis of the evil enrichment that made them possible, and that we can and should talk about the reverse flows of capital that will transform the conditions of Caribbean peoples, that can transform the conditions of peoples of African descent across the New World, that can transform the conditions of black people in Europe, that there is a material debt that is owed to people of African descent globally, and that is not something that should be ignored, and that there are institutional, material, economic, political ways of immediately and systematically addressing that in a context in which one recognizes the fundamental irreparability of the deep history that has formed that has formed these presents out of that past.
So, something too that I was thinking in reading about this as well is just the importance of remembrance. To me, I mean, in thinking of New World slavery and the Holocaust as incommensurable, but both of a type, in the sense that they're both these evils of a scale. That the never forget is what is often said about the Holocaust and the importance of that. And I think, to me, it really emphasizes why things like stupid things in U.S. politics about removing African American history from curriculums and things of that, or this monuments to Civil War. This is a denial of this history,
right?
And it's an inability to allow for an acknowledgement of what was destroyed, which
Absolutely.
was this way of
I mean,
life.
it's to my mind, it's a way of denying the institutionalization of remembrance.
Yeah.
Because to my mind, it's not enough to morally demand that one remember a past, but to find the mechanisms, the technologies, the practices by which that past remains a material part of, an institutionalized part of the presence in which we live.
Wonderful. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you to our audience members for spending this time with us. It's great to see you.
Indeed. Thank you very much.